The billionaire mafia boss was savoring a glass of vintage wine in his private booth when something sharp and steady pierced his composure. It wasn't the glint of a blade or the barrel of a pistol, but the small, unwavering finger of a child pointing directly at his heart. Park Do-hyun looked across the polished mahogany table. A young black girl sat perfectly still in the velvet seat opposite him, her expression calm and her eyes filled with a curious, unafraid light that unsettled a man used to being untouchable. While his enforcers moved with lethal intent to clear the intrusion, Do-hyun raised a single hand to stop them, his gaze locked on the small girl who refused to look away. "Who are you, little one?" he asked, his voice cracking with a rare flicker of discomfort. The air inside the sapphire orchid was thick with the scent of roasted sandalwood and the hushed murmurs of the city's most dangerous elite. At the center of it all sat Park Do-hyun, a man whose silence was more feared than another man's roar. He was a portrait of calculated elegance in a charcoal gray suit, his movements precise as he raised a glass of vintage Bordeaux to his lips. To the world, he was a billionaire philanthropist. To those in the know, he was the shadow king of the Korean Mafia, a man who measured life in profit margins and absolute control. He had just begun to enjoy the quiet solitude of his private, mahogany-lined booth when the atmosphere of the room shifted. It wasn't the sudden burst of a door or the shouting of a rival. It was a ripple of confusion that started at the velvet-roped entrance and moved toward him like a slow-moving tide. His lead enforcer, Kim, shifted his hand toward the holster concealed beneath his blazer, his eyes narrowing at a small figure weaving through the tables. Waiters frozen in place watched as a young black girl, no older than 7, walked with a strange, haunting purpose toward the most feared table in the city. Her hair was pulled back into 2 neat puffs, and she wore a simple yellow sundress that looked painfully bright against the dark, brooding shadows of the restaurant. She didn't stop until she reached the edge of Do-hyun's table. Kim stepped forward, his voice a low growl. "This area is private, kid. Turn around." But the girl didn't move. She didn't even look at Kim. Her gaze was locked onto Do-hyun, her eyes wide and filled with a terrifyingly calm intelligence. Slowly, deliberately, she raised her small arm. Her hand formed a fist, save for her index finger, which she extended until it was pointing directly at the center of Do-hyun's chest. The restaurant went deathly silent. The clink of silverware stopped. Even the soft jazz music seemed to fade into the background. It was a gesture of pure defiance, a child's finger held against a kingpin's heart. Do-hyun lowered his glass, his expression unreadable. For the first time in a decade, he felt the cold prickle of unease. He was used to men trembling in his presence or assassins lunging with blades, but he was not prepared for the weight of this silent accusation. He looked at the finger, then up into the girl's face. She wasn't shaking. Her expression was curious, as if she were studying a specimen under a microscope. "Sir, I'll remove her," Kim whispered, his face flushed with the embarrassment of a security breach. "Stay your hand," Do-hyun commanded. His voice was like ice cracking on a winter lake, quiet, but possessing a lethal edge. He leaned forward, the warm amber light of the chandelier catching the sharp angles of his face. He watched the way the girl stood her ground, her arm never wavering. It was the kind of courage Do-hyun paid millions to instill in his men, yet here it was, free and raw, in a child who shouldn't even know his name. "You have a very steady hand, little one," Do-hyun said, his Korean accent thick and melodic. "Do you know who I am?" The girl tilted her head, her finger still leveled at his heart. "The people outside are scared to say your name," she said, her voice small but surprisingly clear. "They look at the ground when your cars drive by. They hide their faces." Do-hyun felt a corner of his mouth twitch, not quite a smile, but a recognition of truth. "And yet, here you are. You are not hiding your face. You are pointing at mine." "Because you're the only one who can see it," she replied. "See what?" "What they're doing in your name," she said. The composure that Do-hyun had spent a lifetime perfecting finally cracked. A flicker of genuine surprise crossed his features. He reached out, not to push her away, but to gently move his wine glass to the side, clearing the space between them. The contrast. was jarring, his hand, manicured and heavy with a gold signet ring, and her hand, small and dark against the white linen tablecloth. You've walked past my men, through my doors, and interrupted my dinner to point a finger at me, Do-hyun murmured, his eyes searching hers. That is a very expensive gesture. Most people pay for such things with their lives. Elara Johnson didn't flinch. She simply dropped her hand and slid into the velvet booth directly opposite him, sitting with a quiet confidence that mocked the power dynamic of the room. She looked at the expensive food she didn't recognize, and then back at the man who owned it all. I'm not most people, she said. And my dad said you weren't like the others. He said you were a man of honor. I came to see if he was lying. Do-hyun stared at her, the silence stretching long and heavy. Around them, the most powerful people in the city held their breath, watching a 7-year-old girl dismantle the aura of an untouchable boss with nothing more than a steady gaze and a pointed finger. Tell me your name, Do-hyun said, his voice dropping to a level of intimacy that signaled the world around them no longer existed. Elara, she whispered. Well, Elara, Do-hyun said, leaning back as he signaled for Kim to stand down. You have my attention. Now tell me why you've chosen to point your finger at a man who usually hides in the dark. The silence that followed Elara's declaration was not the empty quiet of an abandoned room, but a heavy, pressurized thing that seemed to push against the walls of the Sapphire Orchid. Every person in the restaurant, the high-level associates, the corrupt politicians, and the waitstaff, held their breath, watching the impossible sight of a child sitting comfortably in the inner sanctum of Park Do-hyun. Kim, Do-hyun's right hand, made a sharp, subtle gesture to the security team. Two men began to close in, their faces masks of professional aggression. They saw Elara as a breach, a variable to be neutralized, but before they could reach the edge of the mahogany table, Do-hyun's hand moved. It was a slight flick of the wrist, barely an inch of movement, but the enforcers stopped as if they had hit a glass wall. Back to your posts, Do-hyun said. His voice was soft, but it carried a resonance that made the crystal glasses on the table vibrate. The lady and I are conducting a meeting. The enforcers retreated into the shadows, though their eyes remained fixed on Elara. Do-hyun turned his full attention back to the girl. He noticed the small details now, the way her shoes were scuffed but clean, and how her hands, though small, were folded neatly on the tablecloth. She was terrified. He could see the slight tremor in her shoulders, but her eyes remained steady. She was practicing a brand of discipline that he usually had to beat into his soldiers. The sound of silence is a powerful thing, Elara, Do-hyun murmured, leaning back into the shadows of his booth. In this city, people pay a lot of money to keep things quiet. They pay even more to make sure I don't look their way. And yet, you have spent your evening making sure I see nothing else but you. Elara looked around the opulent room, her gaze lingering on the gold-leafed ceiling and the sparkling chandeliers. My dad said silence isn't always good, she said quietly. He said that when the big men stay silent, the bad men start to think they own the streets. He said you were the biggest man of all, but lately, you've been very quiet. Do-hyun felt a strange, cold sensation in his chest. It wasn't offense. It was the realization that this child was articulating a truth he had been trying to ignore. He had become a ghost in his own empire, insulated by layers of middlemen and digital transactions. He had traded the pulse of the streets for the sterile comfort of high-rise offices and luxury booths. Your father is a man of strong opinions, Do-hyun observed, his eyes narrowing. Where is he tonight? Why isn't he the one pointing fingers at me? The stillness in Elara changed. It went from a shield of courage to a shroud of grief. She looked down at her hands, her voice dropping to a whisper that barely cleared the table. He can't. They took him. The men who wear your badge, but don't have your eyes. They said he stole from the docks. They said it was your order. The air in the booth seemed to turn to ice. Do-hyun's mind moved with the clinical speed that had made him a kingpin. He hadn't ordered an arrest on the docks in months. If someone was using his name to purge loyal workers, it meant there was a cancer growing in his organization, a rival group, or a traitorous lieutenant using his shadow as a cloak for their own crimes. He looked at Elara, really looked at her, and saw the stakes of his own detachment. To him, the docks were a line on a spreadsheet. To her, they were the place her father disappeared. The sound of silence he had cultivated had allowed a lie to grow loud enough to destroy this girl's world. They told you I ordered it, Do-hyun stated, his voice devoid of emotion. They did, Elara said, looking back up, her eyes shining with unshed tears. But my dad said you don't steal from the people who work for you. He said you were a king and kings don't need to be thieves. So I came to ask, are you a king or are you just a quiet man? Do-hyun reached out, his long fingers hovering over the table. For a moment, he looked like he might reach for her, but he simply tapped the wood twice. It was a signal. Kim appeared at his side instantly, leaning in. Get me the manifests for the southern docks, Do-hyun commanded, never taking his eyes off Elara. Find out who has been cleaning house in my name over the last 72 hours. And Kim. Yes, boss. Close the restaurant. I don't want to hear another sound from the outside world until I've heard everything this girl has to say. As the closed sign was flipped on the heavy glass doors and the elite guests were ushered out in a whirlwind of confused whispers, Do-hyun poured a glass of sparkling water and pushed it toward Elara. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was no longer the silence of a man ignoring his city, it was the silence of a predator beginning a hunt. The stillness of the empty restaurant was absolute, save for the distant hum of the kitchen refrigerators and the steady, rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the foyer. Do-hyun watched the girl take a sip of the sparkling water. She handled the heavy crystal glass with a precarious grace, as if she were well aware that everything in this room was designed for people much larger and much colder than herself. My father is Marcus Johnson, she began, her voice gaining a fragile strength in the newfound quiet. He's been working the cranes at Terminal 4 for 12 years. He says the docks are the teeth of the city, that they chew up the world and spit out the pieces. Do-hyun leaned forward, his elbows resting on the mahogany. Marcus Johnson. The name didn't immediately ring a bell, which was exactly the problem. He knew the names of his captains, his bookkeepers, and his political puppets, but the men who actually moved the iron, the teeth of his empire, had become invisible to him. He's a good man, Elara continued, her eyes searching Do-hyun's for any sign of recognition. He never missed a shift. Not even when he was sick. He said he worked for a man named Park, and that as long as we did our jobs, Mr. Park would keep the neighborhood safe. He called you the Silent Guardian. Do-hyun felt a sharp pang of irony. The Silent Guardian was currently sitting in a silk-lined booth while one of his most loyal subjects was being erased. What happened 3 days ago, Elara? Tell me exactly what you saw. It was late. He was supposed to be home at 8 for dinner, she said, her fingers tracing the condensation on her glass. But he didn't come. I waited by the window. Then a black van pulled up, but it wasn't his carpool. 2 men got out. They weren't wearing dock uniforms. They were wearing suits like yours, but cheaper. They looked like they were trying to be important. Do-hyun's jaw tightened. Did they say anything? They told the neighbors that my dad was a thief. They said he was part of a ring stealing high-end electronics from the shipping containers. They shouted it so everyone could hear. They wanted everyone to be ashamed of him. She looked up, her eyes flashing with a sudden, fierce heat. But my dad doesn't steal. He gives. He brings home extra oranges from the bruised crates for the kids on our floor. He fixed the radiator in 3B for free. He's a daughter of the dock's pride, that's what Grandma says. And the police? Do-hyun asked. They wouldn't listen, she whispered. When I went to the station with Grandma, the officer at the desk just looked at the report. He saw your name on the consultant line of the dock's security firm. He told us that if Mr. Park's people took him, then he must be guilty. He told us to go home and wait for the court date that will never come. Do-hyun felt the weight of the girl's words settle into his bones. His name, once a symbol of a brutal but fair order, was being used as a shield for a low-level frame job. The consultant firm she mentioned was a subsidiary he hadn't audited in 2 years. It was a blind spot, a dark corner where someone had decided to build a nest of corruption. They took him to the old warehouse near the North Pier, Elara added, her voice trembling now. I followed them on my bike. I saw them push him inside. He looked so small, Mr. Park. He looked like he was waiting for someone to help him, but the only person who could help him was the man they said ordered the hit. She reached into the small pocket of her yellow dress and pulled out a crumpled photograph. She smoothed it out on the table with the palm of her hand. It was a Polaroid of a tall, broad-shouldered man with a gentle smile, holding a much younger Elara on his shoulders. Behind them, the massive gray skeletons of the shipping cranes rose into the sky. Do-hyun looked at the man in the photo. Marcus Johnson didn't look like a thief. He looked like a man who believed in the system Do-hyun had promised to maintain. By ignoring the daughter of the docks, Do-hyun hadn't just ignored a child. He had allowed the very foundation of his power to be rot from the inside out. They think you don't care, Elara said, her finger once again pointing, though this time it was at the photo of her father. They think you're too busy being rich to notice what they're doing to the people who move your ships. Do-hyun stood up slowly. The chair didn't make a sound against the carpet. He looked at Kim, who was standing by the door with a tablet in hand, his face pale as he read the manifests he had just pulled. Elara, Do-hyun said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous frequency. Your father was right about one thing. I am a man of honor. And he was wrong about another. I am not a silent guardian. Not anymore. Tonight, I am going to be very, very loud. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 4, where Do-hyun realizes the depth of the betrayal within his own ranks? Do-hyun sat in the heavy silence that followed his vow, his eyes fixed on the Polaroid of Marcus Johnson. The image of the smiling man on the docks felt like a rebuke. He had built his empire on the promise of a dark sort of order, a world where, if you followed the rules, you were safe under the shadow of the Park name. But Elara's presence was proof that the shadow had grown too long, concealing rot he had failed to prune. "You said the police told you I ordered it," Do-hyun said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous frequency. "Tell me exactly what they said." "Words have power, Elara. I need to know whose mouth they came from." Elara wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, her small face hardening with a memory that no child should have to carry. "The man at the desk, he didn't even look at me. He just looked at a paper with a blue stamp on it. He told my grandma that Marcus Johnson was a liability to the syndicate's interests. He said you were cleaning up the docks to make room for a new partner. He said you didn't want dead weight anymore." Do-hyun's hand, resting on the mahogany, tightened into a fist. Dead weight. The term was corporate, cold, and entirely foreign to his own vocabulary. He viewed his workers as the blood in his veins. You didn't call blood dead weight unless you were trying to kill the body. And then, Elara whispered, her voice trembling, he said if we kept making noise, the Park family would make sure I ended up in a home far away from here. He said you don't like it when people ask questions about your business. Across the room, Kim cleared his throat softly. He stepped into the light, his face pale as he held out the digital tablet. "Boss, she's right about the firm. The security contract for Terminal 4 was moved 3 weeks ago. It was signed off by a subsidiary called Aegis Logistics. I checked the filing. The board of directors is a list of ghosts, but the primary stakeholder is tied to a holding company in Busan. The Iron Circle," Do-hyun finished for him. The name tasted like ash in his mouth. The Iron Circle was a rival syndicate, a group of younger, hungrier men who lacked the traditional codes of the old guard. They were butchers, not businessmen. If they were operating under his name, it meant the infiltration was deeper than a few corrupt guards. It meant his own house was being used as a slaughterhouse. He looked back at Elara. The accusation she had brought him wasn't just about her father, it was a mirror. She was showing him that he was becoming the villain in a story he thought he was the hero of. To the neighborhood, Park Do-hyun was no longer the protector. He was the monster who kidnapped fathers and threatened orphans. "Elara," he said, his voice softer now, reaching across the table to touch the corner of the photograph. "The men who took your father are not my men. They are thieves wearing my clothes. They use my name because they are too cowardly to use their own. But they made one mistake." Elara tilted her head, a tear finally escaping and rolling down her cheek. "What mistake?" "They thought I was no longer watching," Do-hyun replied. He stood up, the movement fluid and predatory. He didn't look like a businessman anymore. He looked like a man about to go to war. He turned to Kim, his eyes burning with a cold, focused rage. "Kim, I want the location of every Aegis employee on the docks. I want the names of the officers of that precinct. And I want my car. We're going to the North Pier." "Boss," Kim hesitated, "if the Iron Circle is there, it's a trap. They want you to show up. They want to start a war." Do-hyun adjusted the cuffs of his charcoal suit, his expression a mask of lethal calm. "They didn't start a war, Kim. They started an execution. They used my name to hurt a child. In our world, that is the only sin that cannot be forgiven." He looked back at Elara, who was watching him with a mixture of hope and terror. "Stay here with the chef. He will make you whatever you want. I am going to bring the man in that picture home." As he walked out of the sapphire orchid, the silent displacement of power was complete. The billionaire was gone, and the boss had returned, driven by the pointing finger of a girl who was the only one brave enough to tell him the truth. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 5, where Do-hyun begins his investigation into the Shadow Syndicate? The black sedan glided through the rain-slicked streets like a shark moving through dark water. Inside, the only light came from the glowing screen of Kim's tablet and the intermittent flash of street lamps overhead. Do-hyun sat in the back seat, his face a mask of granite. He wasn't looking at the city, he was looking through it, tracing the invisible lines of power that he had allowed to tangle. "The Shadow Syndicate," Do-hyun murmured, the words sounding like a curse. "How did they get so close without a single whisper reaching my desk?" Kim tapped the screen, bringing up a complex web of shell companies and aliases. "They didn't come at us head-on, boss. They're like a parasite. They found the Aegis Logistics subsidiary, a dormant firm we used for tax offsets, and began filling its roster with their own people. To the outside world, they looked like your authorized security. To the dock workers, they were the park enforcers who stopped being fair and started being cruel. Do-hyun watched the data points connect on the screen. The Iron Circle wasn't just stealing cargo, they were stealing his reputation. By acting as the bad version of Park Do-hyun, they were eroding the loyalty of the people who kept the city running. It was a brilliant surgical strike. If the workers hated him and the police feared him, the Iron Circle could eventually step in as liberators. They're using our docks as a transit point for more than just electronics, Kim continued, his voice dropping an octave. I've tracked the shipping manifests. They've been diverting containers to the North Pier warehouse Elara mentioned. It's not just theft, boss. It's human trafficking. They're moving people under the cover of your flag. Do-hyun felt a surge of cold fury that made his pulse thrum in his temples. There were lines he never crossed. He dealt in high-stakes gambling, construction racketeering, and the quiet flow of information, but he never traded in souls. By framing Marcus Johnson a man of integrity, the Iron Circle had removed the only person who might have noticed the wrong kind of cargo moving through Terminal 4. They chose Marcus because he wouldn't take a bribe, Do-hyun said, staring out at the passing gray skeletons of the shipping cranes. And they used his daughter's fear to keep the neighborhood silent. They didn't just target a man, they targeted a family's hope. The car slowed as they approached the industrial district. The upscale glow of the sapphire orchid felt like it belonged to a different lifetime. Here, the air was salty and heavy with the smell of diesel and rust. This was the Shadow Syndicate's playground, a labyrinth of corrugated metal and towering containers where a man could disappear and never be found. We have 12 men stationed at the perimeter, Kim reported, checking his encrypted comms. The Iron Circle has at least 20 inside the warehouse. They think they're invisible, boss. They think you're still at dinner. Do-hyun reached into the side pocket of the door and pulled out a sleek, silenced pistol, checking the magazine with a practiced, rhythmic click. He didn't plan on a long conversation. The time for being the wealthy businessman had ended the moment Elara pointed her finger at him. The Iron Circle wants to live in the shadows, Do-hyun said, his voice a low, lethal hum. So let's turn off the lights. I want every Aegis employee identified. If they aren't on our payroll, they don't leave the pier. And Kim? Yes, boss. Find Marcus. If there is a single scratch on that man, I want the Iron Circle's leadership brought to me. I want to show them what happens when you try to speak for a king. The sedan came to a halt in the darkness of an alleyway overlooking the North Pier. Do-hyun stepped out into the drizzle, the wind whipping his charcoal coat. He looked up at the flickering lights of the warehouse. He could almost feel Elara's gaze still on him from the restaurant, her silent accusation now transformed into a mandate. He wasn't just here to save a worker. He was here to reclaim the soul of the city from the shadows that had dared to move in his name. The North Pier was a graveyard of rusting iron and broken promises. As Do-hyun stepped away from the sedan, the familiar sounds of his industry, the rhythmic groan of the cranes and the distant slap of the tide, felt hollow. He moved through the maze of towering shipping containers with the silence of a ghost, his polished leather shoes clicking softly against the asphalt. He stopped at a junction where the light from a buzzing street lamp struggled to reach the ground. On a nearby concrete pylon, someone had scrawled a message in chalk, "Who watches the watchers?" Below it, a faded company logo for the docks had been defaced with a jagged circle of iron. They aren't just hiding in our shadow, Kim, Do-hyun whispered, his breath visible in the damp air. They've replaced us in the hearts of these people. He reached a section of the docks where the Aegis enforcers were visible. They stood in pairs, their posture loose and disrespectful, smoking cigarettes near a pile of crates. They lacked the discipline of the Park family. They looked like hyenas who had found a carcass. As Do-hyun watched from the darkness, a veteran dock worker, an older man with a limp and a face like a crumpled map, shuffled past them. One of the Aegis men intentionally stuck out a foot, laughing as the old man stumbled. The worker didn't complain. He didn't even look up. He simply gathered his lunch pail and hurried away, his shoulders hunched in a posture of total defeat. Do-hyun felt a cold, sharp pain in his chest. He recognized that man, old Hwan. Hwan had been on these docks since Do-hyun was a teenager collecting envelopes. In the old days, no one would have dared touch a man under Do-hyun's protection. Now, Hwan was a ghost in his own workplace, terrified of men who claimed to serve the very throne Do-hyun sat upon. The ghost of the father isn't just Marcus, Do-hyun realized, his eyes narrowing. It's the spirit of every man who believed in my word. He stepped out of the shadows, walking directly toward the two enforcers. They didn't recognize him at first. To them, he was just another wealthy suit who had wandered into the wrong part of town. "Hey, private property," one of them shouted, dropping his cigarette. "Get lost before we break something you can't fix." Do-hyun didn't stop. He didn't even slow down. "I am Park Do-hyun," he said, his voice a low, terrifying vibration. "And you're standing on my soul." The men froze. The name hit them like a physical blow. One reached for a holster, but before his fingers could even graze the leather, Kim was there, a blurred shadow that pinned the man's hand to the crate with a clinical, bone-snapping grip. Do-hyun walked past the groaning enforcer, his eyes fixed on the warehouse at the end of the pier. He could feel the weight of the photograph in his pocket, the image of Marcus and Elara. Marcus was the ghost now, a man being punished for his integrity, discarded like refuse by men who valued greed over honor. "Find Hwan," Do-hyun commanded Kim, without looking back. "Tell him the king has returned. Tell him to gather the men who still remember the old rules. I don't want a single person in this district to wonder who runs these docks by sunrise." As he approached the warehouse doors, the pacing of the night shifted. The slow, heavy dread was being replaced by a sharp, electric tension. Do-hyun wasn't just a businessman anymore. He was a restorer of order. He was the man who had ignored a little girl's plea, and now he was the man who would burn down everything the Shadow Syndicate had built to make it right. He could almost hear Elara's voice in the wind. "Are you a king, or are you just a quiet man?" He pushed the heavy steel door open, the screech of the metal sounding like a war cry. The hunt for the ghost had ended. The reckoning had begun. The interior of the warehouse was a cavern of harsh fluorescent light and the rhythmic thrum of industrial fans. Unlike the chaotic brawls of his youth, Do-hyun's approach was a masterclass in clinical efficiency. He moved with a surgical precision that matched the razor-sharp creases of his suit, a silent specter navigating the labyrinth of crates. Behind him, his elite team flowed like liquid shadows, their movements synchronized and silent, neutralizing the iron circle sentries before they could even draw a breath to scream. Do-hyun did not hide. He walked down the center aisle of the terminal, his presence a gravitational force that pulled the air out of the room. When a lookout on a high catwalk spotted him and reached for a rifle, a single red dot appeared on the man's forehead. The lookout froze, realizing that he was already dead. He just hadn't fallen yet. "Don't fire unless I give the word," Do-hyun's voice echoed through the vast space, calm and terrifyingly steady. "I want them to see the face of the man they've been impersonating." As he rounded a corner marked with the stolen Aegis logo, he found the heart of the rot. For men in tactical gear were laughing, tossing a heavy ring of keys between them. In the center of the circle, slumped against a rusted support beam, was Marcus Johnson. The man from the photograph was unrecognizable. His dockworker's jacket was shredded, and his face was a map of dark bruises, but his eyes, those same intelligent eyes Elara possessed, were fixed on the floor in a stubborn, silent prayer. "The key to a good frame job," one of the Iron Circle men said, oblivious to the shadow looming behind him, "is making sure the victim looks the part. By the time we're done with you, Marcus, even your daughter will believe you're a thief." "She doesn't," Do-hyun said. The men spun around, their laughter dying in their throats. They looked at the charcoal suit, the gold signet ring, and the eyes that held the coldness of a deep-sea trench. They saw the surgical precision of a man who had spent 20 years perfecting the art of the endgame. "Who the hell are you?" the leader stammered, his hand hovering over his holster. "I am the owner of these docks," Do-hyun replied, stepping into the light. "And you are the trespassers who made the mistake of thinking I had stopped counting my blessings." In one fluid motion, Do-hyun's team stepped from the shadows, their weapons leveled with terrifying stillness. It wasn't a standoff, it was a foregone conclusion. The Iron Circle men realized they were outmatched not just in numbers, but in soul. They were street thugs playing at being kings, and they had just come face to face with the real thing. Do-hyun didn't look at the gunman. He walked straight to Marcus Johnson. He knelt in the dirt of the warehouse floor, ignoring the ruin of his expensive trousers. With a small, silver pocket knife, he sliced through the zip ties binding Marcus's wrists with a single, practiced flick. "Your daughter is waiting for you at the Sapphire Orchid, Marcus," Do-hyun said, his voice dropping to a low, respectful register. "She told me you said I was a man of honor. I've come to prove you weren't a liar." Marcus looked up, his breath hitching as he recognized the man from the news, the man whose name had been used to torture him for 3 days. He saw no malice in Do-hyun's face, only a profound, focused justice. She found you?" Marcus rasped. "She pointed a finger at the sun, Marcus." "And the sun had no choice but to listen," Do-hyun replied. He stood up and turned back to the Iron Circle leader, who was now trembling. The surgical part of the evening was over. Now it was time for the extraction. "Kim, clear the building. I want the cargo manifested, the captives freed, and these animals crated. We're shipping them back to Busan in pieces of their own reputation." The warehouse erupted into a blur of controlled motion. Within minutes, the Iron Circle's operation was dismantled with the same cold, clinical grace Do-hyun applied to everything. As he helped Marcus toward the exit, Do-hyun felt the weight of the night beginning to shift. He had cut out the cancer. Now, all that remained was to heal the wound he had allowed to fester. "Would you like me to continue with Chapter 8, where the high-stakes raid reaches its boiling point?" The heavy steel doors of the North Pier's main terminal didn't just open. They were erased. At a synchronized signal from Kim, the secondary breach teams deployed localized charges that took out the hinges of the side entrances with a muffled, concussive thud. The breach was not a chaotic explosion, but a controlled tear in the reality the Iron Circle had built. Do-hyun stepped through the settling dust of the main hall, his silhouette framed by the flickering orange glow of a nearby transformer. The warehouse was a cavern of secrets, and as the lights flared under his command, the true scale of the Shadow Syndicate's operation was laid bare. This wasn't just a warehouse for stolen electronics. Behind a false wall of shipping containers lay a hidden sector, the breach into a darkness Do-hyun had never sanctioned. Rows of cramped, makeshift living quarters were visible, filled with people whose eyes reflected the same hollow terror he had seen in the neighborhood. These were the souls the Iron Circle had been moving under his flag. The sight hit Do-hyun with the force of a physical blow. To a man who prided himself on a kingdom built on respect, this was a desecration. "Clear the pens," Do-hyun commanded, his voice a low, vibrating snarl that carried through the vast space. "Get them air. Get them water. And find me the man who holds the keys to this cage." The breach had startled the core of the Iron Circle's leadership. From a glass-walled mezzanine overlooking the floor, a man in a sharp, cheap suit, the one Elara had described, began screaming orders. He was younger than Do-hyun, with a face full of unearned arrogance that was rapidly melting into panic. He raised a submachine gun, but before he could level it, the glass around him shattered inward. Do-hyun's snipers didn't hit the man, they hit the structure around him, a deliberate display of superior force meant to paralyze. Do-hyun began to climb the metal stairs to the mezzanine, his movements steady and rhythmic. He didn't rush. He wanted every step to echo in the man's chest. "You're making a mistake, Park," the man shouted, his voice cracking as he backed into the corner of his office. "The Iron Circle has backers you can't even dream of. This territory is changing. We're the future." Do-hyun reached the top of the stairs and stepped into the ruined office, glass crunching under his shoes. He looked at the man, then out at the warehouse floor where Marcus was being tended to by Kim's medics. He thought of the Sapphire Orchid, the $5 bill from the reference story he had heard of, and the pointing finger of a child who was braver than this shivering coward. "The future doesn't belong to scavengers," Do-hyun said, his eyes as cold as the deep Pacific. "You thought silence was a sign of weakness. You thought because I didn't walk the docks every night, I had forgotten how to bleed them." He walked up to the man, who was now hyperventilating. Do-hyun didn't draw his weapon. He simply reached out and took the man's gun, twisting it out of his hand with a contemptuous ease that spoke of decades of violence. You used my name to frame a father, Do-hyun whispered, leaning in so close the man could see his own terrified reflection in the boss's pupils. You used my ships to move human cargo. You breached the only rule that matters. You brought dishonor to my house. The breach was complete. The Iron Circle's fortress had become their tomb. Down on the floor, the captives were being led out into the night air, blinking at the stars they thought they would never see again. The high-stakes raid had reached its boiling point, and as the adrenaline began to level out, it left behind a cold, hard clarity. Do-hyun looked down at the man, who was now sobbing on the floor. Kim, he called out over the railing. Don't waste the ammunition. Call the authorities we don't own. Let them see what the Aegis firm has been hiding. I want the Iron Circle's name to be the only one on the front page tomorrow. As he walked back down to Marcus, Do-hyun felt the weight of the night finally begin to settle. The breach into the underworld's darkest corner was closed, but the transformation of the king was only just beginning. He had reclaimed his docks, but he still had a promise to return to a little girl in a yellow dress. The chaos of the breach subsided into a chilling, structured order as Do-hyun's men secured the perimeter. In the center of the mezzanine office, the man who had been screaming orders, a high-ranking lieutenant of the Iron Circle named Choi, was forced onto his knees. The shattered glass of the office partitions crunched under Do-hyun's feet as he paced a slow, predatory circle around him. This is a misunderstanding, Park. Choi gasped, his bravado replaced by a desperate, sweating panic. We weren't moving against you. We were expanding the market. The logistics were already in place. We just used your name to keep the local precincts from asking questions. It's a 60-40 split, Park. 60% of the trafficking revenue goes straight to your accounts, laundered through the Busan holdings. You don't even have to touch it. Do-hyun stopped walking. He looked down at Choi, his expression so devoid of heat that it was more terrifying than a scream. You think I came here to discuss percentages? Think about the overhead. Choi scrambled, his voice pitching higher as he misinterpreted Do-hyun's silence for consideration. The girls, the electronics, the racketeering at Terminal 4, it's a gold mine. Your old ways are too slow, too heavy. You protect these people, but for what? A bit of loyalty? Loyalty doesn't buy ships. We're offering you a partnership. We do the dirty work, you take the lion's share, and we all get rich. It's just business. Do-hyun reached into his pocket and pulled out the crumpled photograph of Marcus and Elara. He held it in front of Choi's eyes. Is this business? Choi glanced at the photo and scoffed, a flicker of his former arrogance returning. The dock worker? He was a nobody. A glitch in the system. We framed him to send a message to the rest of the union. It's efficient. You of all people should understand that. The air in the room seemed to vanish. Do-hyun leaned down, his face inches from Choi's. The gold signet ring on his finger caught the harsh fluorescent light, a symbol of a legacy built on a code that Choi was too small to understand. You call him a glitch, Do-hyun whispered, his voice a low, lethal vibration. I call him the foundation. You think my power comes from the money in those accounts? It comes from the fact that when a man like Marcus Johnson looks at my flag, he feels safe. When you targeted him, you didn't just break a rule. You declared that my word means nothing. Park, be reasonable. There is no room for negotiating with a man who trades in the fear of children, Do-hyun interrupted. He straightened up, his eyes turning to flint. You offered me 60% of a pile of filth. I am rejecting the offer. In fact, I am liquidating your entire existence. Choi's eyes went wide. You can't kill me. The Iron Circle will. The Iron Circle is currently being dismantled by the very police officers you thought you bought, Do-hyun said, glancing at Kim, who stood by the door with a phone held to his ear. I've handed them the manifests, the security footage, and the location of your offshore servers. By tomorrow morning, your partners will be fighting for their lives in a courtroom, and you will be the one they blame for the leak. Do-hyun turned his back on Choi, signaling to his men. Take him out. Not to the harbor. To the precinct. I want him processed by the most honest sergeant they have left. Let him explain his business model to a judge. You're throwing away millions. Choi screamed as he was dragged toward the stairs. For a dock worker and a little girl? You're crazy, Park. You're losing your edge. Do-hyun didn't look back. He walked to the edge of the mezzanine and looked down at the warehouse floor. Marcus was standing now, supported by Kim's medics, looking up at the man who had saved him. Do-hyun felt a strange, quiet sense of clarity. For years, he had been a businessman, losing himself in the cold math of power. But tonight, because a young girl had the courage to point a finger, he had remembered that he was something else entirely. He wasn't losing his edge. He was sharpening it. Kim, Do-hyun said as he descended the stairs. Make sure the families of everyone found in those containers are taken care of. Find them homes, jobs, and security. And burn this warehouse to the ground. I want nothing left of the Iron Circle's business in my city. As he stepped out into the rain, leaving the shouting behind, Do-hyun's mind was already miles away, back at a quiet booth in an upscale restaurant where a yellow dress was the only light that mattered. He had rejected the deal of a lifetime, and in doing so, he had saved his soul. The heavy iron gates of the North Pier creaked open as the first touch of dawn began to bleed gray light over the horizon. The rain had softened to a fine mist, clinging to the wool of Do-hyun's coat as he walked alongside Marcus Johnson. The dock worker moved slowly, his legs stiff from days of confinement, but with every step he took away from the warehouse, the shadow of the Shadow Syndicate seemed to shrink behind him. The air outside was cold and sharp, flavored with the salt of the harbor, the air of a free man. Do-hyun signaled to Kim, who stood by the open door of a secondary sedan. Inside the car were clean clothes, water, and a medical kit, but more importantly, it was a vessel for the release that had been earned through blood and a child's courage. The authorities are already at the precinct, Marcus, Do-hyun said, his voice low as he watched the blue and red lights of distant police cruisers beginning to swarm the far end of the pier. The officers who processed your arrest are being detained as we speak. By the time the sun is fully up, your record will be scrubbed. You were never a thief. You were a casualty of a war you didn't know was happening. Marcus stopped near the car, turning to look at the man who had been a myth to him for 12 years. Up close, Do-hyun didn't look like the monster the Iron Circle had described. He looked tired, his eyes reflecting a deep, ancient weariness that came from carrying the weight of a city's secrets. Why? Marcus rasped, his voice still thick from the lack of water. I'm just one man on your docks. Why did you come for me yourself? Do-hyun reached into his pocket and pulled out the Polaroid Elara had given him. He handed it back to Marcus. The photo was slightly damp from the night's mist, but the image of the father and daughter was as clear as ever. I didn't come for a dock worker, Do-hyun replied. I came because a little girl sat in my booth and told me that I had lost my way. She didn't ask for money, and she didn't ask for mercy. She asked for justice. She believed in the man you told her I was. I realized that if I let you disappear, I would be killing the only version of myself that was worth a damn. Marcus took the photo, his fingers trembling as he looked at Elara's face. A single, heavy sob escaped him, a release of the tension that had kept him upright for 72 hours. He leaned against the car, the reality of his survival finally sinking in. Go home, Marcus, Do-hyun said softly. My men will drive you. You'll be taken to a private clinic first to make sure those bruises are treated, and then you'll be taken to the Sapphire Orchid. Someone is waiting for you there. Thank you, Marcus whispered, the words carrying a weight that transcended a simple gesture of gratitude. Do-hyun nodded once, a formal acknowledgement of the bond that now existed between the king and the worker. He watched as Kim helped Marcus into the back seat. As the car pulled away, disappearing into the morning fog, Do-hyun stood alone on the pier. The release wasn't just for Marcus, it was for the entire district. The stranglehold of the Iron Circle had been broken, and the silence that had allowed them to flourish was being replaced by the steady, healthy rhythm of a territory reclaimed. He looked at his hands. They were clean, but he could still feel the phantom weight of the keys he had taken from the warehouse. He had released a father, but he had also released himself from the cold, clinical detachment that had nearly cost him his honor. Kim, Do-hyun said into his earpiece as the second car pulled up to collect him. Tell the restaurant to prepare a breakfast. The best they have. And tell the girl, tell Elara her father is on his way. The king of the East Side stepped into his car, leaving the wreckage of the North Pier behind. The night was over, and for the first time in a long time, the dawn felt like a beginning rather than just another deadline. The release was complete, but the reunion, the final piece of the debt he owed, was still to come. The sapphire orchid was a sanctuary of golden light and quiet elegance, standing in stark contrast to the cold, industrial grit of the North Pier. When Do-hyun stepped back through the heavy glass doors, the morning sun was just beginning to touch the high windows, casting long, amber shadows across the polished wood. The restaurant was empty of its usual power players, yet it felt more alive than it had in years. At the center of the room, sitting in the very same booth where the night had begun, was Elara. She had fallen asleep against the velvet cushions, her small head resting on her arms, but she bolted upright the moment the door clicked shut. Her eyes, wide and searching, locked onto Do-hyun as he approached. He walked toward her with a deliberate slowness, his charcoal coat still damp with the harbor's mist. He didn't say a word until he reached the table. He reached into his pocket and placed the Polaroid of Marcus back onto the linen cloth. "The debt is settled, Elara," he said softly. The girl stared at the photo, then back at Do-hyun. Before she could ask the question that was trembling on her lips, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the foyer. Marcus Johnson appeared, flanked by Kim. He was wearing a clean jacket, his face bandaged, but his eyes bright with a profound, disbelieving relief. The return to the restaurant was not marked by a grand speech or a display of wealth. It was defined by the high-pitched, breathless cry that escaped Elara as she scrambled out of the booth. She collided with her father in the center of the room, her small arms wrapping around his waist as if she could anchor him to the earth. Marcus collapsed to his knees, burying his face in her shoulder, his broad frame shaking with silent, restorative sobs. Do-hyun stood back in the shadows, watching the reunion. He felt a strange, unfamiliar warmth in his chest, a quiet satisfaction that no successful merger or territorial expansion had ever provided. He looked at Kim, who stood near the entrance, and saw his stone-faced enforcer blink away a rare trace of moisture. "Breakfast is served, boss," Kim whispered, signaling to the kitchen staff. Do-hyun didn't join them at the table. He knew that this moment belonged to the Johnsons, a private peace reclaimed from a public war. Instead, he signaled to the head chef to bring out the finest spread the kitchen could produce, warm pastries, fresh fruit, and steaming tea, placing it before the father and daughter as they sat together, hand in hand, in the golden booth. As Elara began to eat, she looked up at Do-hyun. She was no longer pointing a finger in accusation. Instead, she reached into the small pocket of her yellow dress and pulled out a single, shiny gold coin, a token she had found on the sidewalk weeks ago and kept for luck. She pushed it across the table toward him. "For your trouble," she said, her voice steady and clear. Do-hyun looked at the coin. In the world of the Korean Mafia, he was a billionaire who dealt in millions, but as he picked up the small piece of metal, he treated it with the reverence of a holy relic. He tucked it into his vest pocket, right over his heart. "Consider the bill paid in full, Miss Johnson," Do-hyun replied, bowing his head slightly in a gesture of genuine respect. He turned and walked toward the back of the restaurant, his footsteps light on the carpet. He had returned to the Sapphire Orchid a changed man. He was still the boss, and he was still the shadow that governed the city's pulse, but the return had taught him that his power was not a throne to sit upon, but a shield to be carried. As the sound of Elara's laughter, bright and musical, filled the dining room, Do-hyun sat in his private office and looked out at the awakening city. He was no longer just a man who lived in the dark. He was a man who had seen the light of a little girl's courage, and he knew that as long as he protected that light, his empire would never truly fall. Years passed, and the Sapphire Orchid remained the silent, beating heart of the city's upper echelon. But for those who knew where to look, the atmosphere inside the restaurant had fundamentally changed. It was no longer just a fortress of cold transactions. It had become the origin point of a new rule. In his private office above the dining floor, Park Do-hyun sat at his desk, the skyline of the city sprawling out behind him. The charcoal suits remained as sharp as ever, and his influence had only grown, yet his legacy was no longer measured solely by the ships in the harbor or the digits in his offshore accounts. On the wall directly facing his desk, positioned even higher than his maps of territorial influence, hung a small, framed object. It wasn't a degree, a commendation, or a masterpiece. It was a simple, hand-drawn picture of a tall man in a dark suit standing next to a small girl in a bright yellow dress. Beside the frame sat a small gold coin, the very one Elara had pushed across the table years ago. The new rule was unwritten but absolute. The neighborhood was no longer just a resource to be managed, it was a community to be guarded. Do-hyun had purged the Rod of the Iron Circle and replaced the Shadow Syndicate with a network of protection that focused on the people who moved the iron and paved the streets. He had learned that true power didn't come from being feared by everyone, but from being the one person a terrified child could point to when the world went dark. Marcus Johnson had returned to the docks, not as a broken man, but as a foreman. Under Do-hyun's quiet mandate, Terminal 4 became the safest and most efficient sector in the port. The workers were no longer dead weight or glitches in the system. They were the backbone of an empire that finally knew the value of its own soul. As for Elara, she grew up under a silent, invisible canopy of protection. She never knew that her college tuition was paid for by a philanthropic trust that shared the same bank as the Park family. She never knew that the men in dark suits who occasionally watched her walk home from the library were there to ensure that no shadow ever touched her again. She grew up brave, intelligent, and kind, eventually becoming a human rights lawyer who fought for the very people the system tried to ignore. Every year, on the anniversary of that night in the Sapphire Orchid, a small delivery would arrive at the restaurant's back door. It was never a plea for help anymore. Instead, it was a simple yellow rose and a note that read, "Thank you for being the king my father said you were." Do-hyun would take the rose and place it in a vase on his desk. It served as a reminder that the most dangerous man in the city was also the most vital protector of its hope. He had realized that the little girl hadn't just saved her father that night, she had saved him from becoming the very monster he fought against. In the underworld of the city, names were made and broken in the dark. But the name of Park Do-hyun was spoken of with a rare, hushed respect that transcended fear. He had proved that even in a world of wolves, honor was the only currency that never devalued. The king had found his purpose, not in the silence of a luxury booth, but in the clarity of a child's steady finger. And as the sun set over the docks, casting long, golden shadows over the city, Do-hyun knew that his territory was finally safe, not because he ruled it, but because he finally cared enough to lead it.